Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 3326, Modern African History. So, our topic for this week is a big one. It's one we've been driving at for quite a while, and that is the formal colonization of the continent of Africa. So, we can definitely see this as sort of a cause and effect pattern. What's happening is we have the slave trade gives way to legitimate trade, during which time anti-slave trading treaties are established with local leaders in Africa, and Europeans start forming their spheres of influence. Those spheres of influence will be formalized into colonial claims in December of 1884 and January of 1885. This is the date that we can say is truly the beginning of European colonialism in Africa. And that date represents the Berlin Conference. Now, the Berlin Conference comes as a result of the Portuguese telling the rest of Europe that we need to have a meeting. We have to get together to figure out how to resolve any disputes that might come up from claiming territories in Africa. In particular, the Portuguese were trying to grab some islands off the west coast of Africa. And ultimately, it's going to be Germany who responds to this call for a meeting. In particular, their Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, is going to invite all of the world's imperial powers to Berlin to discuss how to peacefully divide and conquer Africa. And the whole idea of the Berlin Conference is it's not to basically come up with rules for how you take over African militaries or political entities. It's about how to make sure there's no conflict between Europeans as they're grabbing these territories up in Africa. They don't really fear coming into armed conflict with African militaries. What they fear is coming into conflict with one another. The British don't want to fight the French in open warfare for a territory in Africa. The Germans don't want to fight the Portuguese. And so the Berlin Conference is all about coming up with ground rules to avoid these conflicts as European powers start grabbing African territories for themselves. So the ground rules that are laid out at this conference are threefold. Number one, you have to plant your flag in the territory that you are claiming. That's rather innocuous and fairly straightforward. Number two, you have to have a tradition of formal treaty negotiations with the local leaders in the territory that you're claiming. This brings us back to the days of legitimate trade and spheres of influence. It was during the process of getting all these anti-slave trading treaties signed that Europeans were able to establish that sort of framework for having a treaty relationship with an African territory, and it would be those anti-slave trading treaties that formed the basis of European claims at the Berlin Conference that allowed them to start grabbing African territories in 1885. And then finally, you had to maintain a standing police force, as they said. That's not what we think of today as a police force. What you really need to think about here is basically a standing military in the territory. The idea is that if there's any resistance to imposing formal colonial rule, you need to have a military there to put that resistance down immediately. And once you've met these three goals, then you can ultimately go ahead and claim your territory in Africa. And from there, we are going to basically start to see the modern borders of Africa take shape. And this brings us to an issue that will come up after the colonial period, during nationalism and decolonization. What ultimately happens here, and what we need to understand, is that Africa is not an African concept. If you go into most African languages prior to, we'll say, 1800, there is no such thing as Africa. There's no word Africa to describe every person living on the continent. Even more so, there is certainly no sort of corollary for the modern nations that we see today. What's happening is Europeans are looking at a map of Africa, they're drawing a line around what they think they can claim, and they're calling that a new nation or a new colony. And so what's going to happen is you're taking a bunch of different and disparate ethnic groups that don't really have any historical connection to one another. And sometimes they do, but the connection is not particularly strong. They might have been, enemies, people who have been warring with each other prior to the Europeans showing up. But what it's going to do is they're going to take a whole bunch of different ethnicities and they're going to say, hey, guess what? You're all one modern nation now. You have to work together politically now. You have to live together under the same rules. And ultimately, this is going to become a problem because the British, the French, every other European power, they use divide and conquer tactics. And this is going to create a lot of animosity between different ethnic groups, different linguistic groups, different religious groups that inhabit the continent. And those sort of tensions tend to boil over during nationalism and after nationalism when these nations regain their independence. So there are some hallmarks of colonialism across the board that were practiced by the French, the British, the Germans, the Portuguese, all the European powers. They did share a lot of the same habits. And the first habit we need to talk about is the spread of Christianity. We often discuss colonialism in light of what we call the 3 C's. The 3 C's are Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Now, different European nations pursued each of these individual goals to different ends, but all 3 of these things were a hallmark of the colonial process. You couldn't really claim a sphere of influence until you had some ability to work and connect with the people who are living in that territory. And what generally is the first thing in on the ground, the first European influence to ever emerge in most areas in Africa, are mission-run schools, basically Bible schools. So Christianity comes first and sort of paves the way for the other 2 C's to come afterwards. Now the second C is commerce. And what's going to happen across all colonies that is going to be a really sort of clear hallmark of what they're trying to do is the economic end of colonialism. Colonialism is all about exploitation. If I'm England and I'm colonizing Nigeria, I'm not doing it for the economic good of Nigeria. I'm doing it for my economic benefit as England. Same thing with France and Senegal or Morocco or in Algeria and the Portuguese and Angola and Mozambique. They're all there for their own profit and their own gain. And so to this end, they are not interested in developing domestic consumption patterns. They're not interested in having Africans grow food that Africans eat. They're not interested in having Africans maintain crops like cotton that they can stitch into their own clothes. That's not what this is all about. What it's about is creating export goods, and those are generally agricultural, timber, or mineral-based sorts of trade products. What they're looking to do is use the African labor force to exploit African resources, then ship it around globally so that the metropole, or the governing body in Europe, the sort of capital of the colonial powers, so respectively London or Paris or Berlin or Seville or Lisbon, all of these areas are going to be stepping up and making the money in this particular scheme. It's all an exploitative process. But the question becomes then, why do Africans start working in the industries that Europeans want? We're not talking about Europeans marching in often and basically forcing people to work at gunpoint. That's something that's going to happen quite a bit under the Portuguese and the Germans. They really favor more of a forced labor camp style setup in their early colonies. And what they're basically doing is saying work or die. Those are your 2 options. But the British and the French, who are the largest colonial powers on the continent, they don't operate that way. They think of themselves as being slightly more civil. What they're going to do is say, very simply, you have to pay us taxes. And guess what? We don't want goats. We don't want yams. We don't want salt. We don't want palm oil. We want money. We want currency, hard currency. And what that's going to refer to is if you're in a British colony, they want Great British pounds. That's how you have to pay your taxes. If you're in a French colony, they want francs. In German colonies, they want Deutschmarks. And so ultimately what's happening here is the only place you can actually acquire that currency is when you're working for the colonial government. The old economy of growing different vegetables and fruits to feed people locally, that's not paying in Great British pounds. That's not paying in francs or Deutschmarks. That's not paying in any European currency. So you can't pay your taxes with that. The only way you can pay your taxes is to go work in a diamond mine or a gold mine or a rubber plantation or a palm oil plantation or cutting down timber or building a railway or a roadway or something that the British or the French or whatever colonial power that is operating there, whatever they want to see built, that's what you're going to be working on because that's the only way you can pay them their taxes. And so that's the scheme by which they force most African laborers into their economic system. Now, the final hallmark, or the 3rd C of colonialism, is civilization, and I should be putting that in quotes. Civilization. What I mean by this is a European notion of civilization. And this goes hand in hand with a concept called paternalism. Basically, Europeans are coming in and they're viewing Africans from a very condescending and racist standpoint. It's basically they view Africans as children who need to be taught, held by the hand and guided into the 21st and or 20th and 21st centuries, respectively, depending on when you're seeing these things start to break off or how you feel about neo-colonialism. But the idea is that essentially Europeans are coming into these colonial schemes and they're saying Africans don't deserve African resources. They're wasting them. And what's happening here is you have industrial societies looking at pre-industrial societies and saying, you're not taking full advantage of the resources you have at your disposal. So it's only right for us to come in and exploit those resources. Thus, we're going to show you how to exploit them. You'll grow and become more like us. That's the idea. They want to teach. They want to guide Africans. But that's not what this is about. They're not guiding Africans for the well-being of Africans. In fact, I think you can make the argument they're not guiding them at all. They're exploiting them, but this is the social justification that Europeans are going to use. A lot like with the slave trade when we heard them say, well, better to be a slave in a Western system or under a Christian slave master than in a pagan slave system or an African slave system. That's what they're going to say again. Better to be learning how to live like a civilized person from a European. And of course, the only notion they understand of civilization or civility is one that syncs neatly with their own. They don't respect African institutions of civilization and civility. And so ultimately, they're going to be saying, you need to model us. You have to mimic us. You have to act like we do. And nowhere is this more clearly seen than within the French colonies. In particular, in the French sub-Saharan colonies. What we're seeing is the French are grabbing a lot of territory in North Africa, right along the Mediterranean. They have different policies to deal with people there. That's where they're sending their large settler classes, and that's ultimately going to lead to a lot of violent decolonization processes a little later in the 20th century. But ultimately, because the people there are largely Caucasian racially, they're people, as we saw, people moving from the Arabic continent and Arabizing North Africa. Well, now these are not European, but Caucasian people. They are people who are coming from the Middle East. They're Arabic for the most part. And so they're not treated with the same level of prejudice and racism as are dark-skinned sub-Saharan Africans. And what you see with the French, they practice this policy of assimilation. What that means is act just like we do. Blend right into the French culture. And what they're going to try and do is they want to turn Africans into what they call petit français. And what that means is junior Frenchmen, little Frenchmen. And that shows you this concept of paternalism. Even if the African subjects under their colonial regimes mimic the French in every single way, they still don't become fully French. They're still just little Frenchmen. And that shows you this very condescending attitude that Europeans bring to the continent with them. But you can become one of these petit français through a couple of different methods. Number one, you would have to be living in one of the 4 communes of West Africa, and that is going to be Saint Louis. They're mainly the 4 communes are not, I shouldn't say West Africa, they're specific to Senegal. If you live in one of the communes or major cities of that colony, which are Saint Louis, Dakar, Gorée, which is an island that we've encountered before. Gorée was one of where one of the major slave forts were, slave fortifications off the coast of Africa. And then the 4th one is Rufisque. If you live in one of these cities within colonial Senegal, you have a better shot at becoming a French citizen. This is a unique process. They're trying to entice Africans to act like French people by offering them citizenship. This doesn't happen under the British. This doesn't happen under any other European power. This is very, very specific to the French. And so what that really entails is it means you have to speak imperfect, unaccented French. You have to follow the Catholic interpretation of Christianity. You have to have converted to Catholicism. You have to dress like French people do. You have to act in the same societal manner as French people do. You interact in public in the same way. You have the same gendered understanding of how women and men relate to one another. And so really what's happening here is they're setting these very high bars for African subjects to try to attain this citizenship. And really only we see about 2,500 people out of a total from 15 million are actually going to be able to gain French citizenship through this process. So you can really kind of call it like a carrot on a stick. They're trying to say, oh, you get citizenship if you do exactly what we will ask you to do. But we're going to set the bar so high as so ultimately very few people actually gain access to this kind of status. And so assimilation really is the hallmark and what makes French colonialism quite a bit different from some of the other processes we see on the continent. Now, the British are going to be dealing in a bit of a different way. Their biggest concern is just money, money, money. It's commerce. They want their export economies to be flowing as smoothly as possible. And to that end, they're going to try to basically leave local power structures in place whenever and wherever they can. The British, because they're so concerned with money, they don't want to put a lot of colonial administrators on the ground. That costs money. If I've got a bunch of British people living in my colony, I have to pay them. I have to build houses for them. I have to build schools for their kids. I have to build hospitals for when they get sick. I have to build roadways to get to and from their house. I don't have to do this for my African subjects. I just have to do it for my colonial administrators. And so ultimately, they want to keep costs down, so they come up with these what we call the dual mandated system of colonial rule. And this takes form in something called direct rule and indirect rule. And that's something that the British are going to use in other colonial areas around the world. It's sort of the brainchild of a guy named Lord Frederick Lugard, who worked in both India and Nigeria. And specifically, he comes up with it in Nigeria. And really, direct rule is where the British are going to control all levels of government, and they're going to use British citizens, i.e. British people, and administrators for all levels of the government that's running on the ground. Basically, what's happening there is in the Hausa territories, where I've mentioned before, you have in particular, the Sokoto Caliphate is running up there in Nigeria. You have basically a very hierarchical structure of power that stops with the caliph of the Sokoto Caliphate. What the British are going to do with direct rule is just say, all right, Sokoto Caliphate, you answer to us now, and our administrators are in charge of you. You answer to a white British citizen who lives there on the ground. So now to run your entire colony, we just need one person. And so on the flip side, they're also trying to deal with the decentralized people of Igbo land, who don't have one clear king or ruler for any specific territory. And that's where they put indirect rule into place. And what this does is it appoints what you call a warrant chief. Basically somebody that the British are just going to say, you're in charge of the area now, because quite frankly, in Igbo land, we can't tell who's in charge here. We're not sure anyone's in charge. And so ultimately what they're going to do is just pick somebody. And the problem with this is who they're picking is generally a younger person, and we're talking about societies in which traditional authority is vested in the older generations. And that younger person is generally their only qualification is that they speak English. And so they can communicate better with the colonial authorities there. But what that does is it throws the entire local power system into flux. Everybody's confused by this. You're now a young guy who, in the traditional system of authority, had absolutely no power, becomes all-powerful over an area. Now, this rule of the warrant chief under indirect rule is something that's so unpopular, the British are going to have to abandon this in 1929 after an event called the Igbo Women's War. Basically, the warrant chief in this one area of Igbo land in Nigeria, southeastern Nigeria, is going to enact a number of unpopular policies and inhibit the women who are running the local economy there. And the women turn to traditional methods of shaming this guy and basically telling him, you don't have any authority over us. And they do what is known as sitting on a woman to shame this warrant chief. This is a process that the British saw as distasteful at best. But really, this is something that Igbo women have been using for a very long time traditionally. When men overstep their bounds in society, women would use this to check them and bring them back into their place. And so what it's all about is women would gather around outside of a man's house, and that's what they do to this warrant chief in 1929. And they throw trash and garbage at his house. Sometimes they even throw feces and stuff. Just to really make the outside of the appearance of the house look terrible. They yell things about him and his family. They challenge his masculinity. And ultimately, if the man does not respond to any of these kinds of intimidating tactics, what they'll ultimately do is drag the guy out of the house, and that's what they do with the warrant chief in 1929. And the older women of the community lift their skirts and expose their genitals. They literally sit on his face and chest. And I want to be very, very clear here. There's nothing sexual about this. It is meant to shame the man. What it is in traditional Igbo society is you should feel ashamed when you see an old woman naked, an elderly woman in the nude, because it's akin to seeing your mother naked in this communal sort of child-rearing system. And so that kind of shame is ultimately something that could force a person to have to leave a community entirely, or in the case of this warrant chief in 1929, this guy just flat out kills himself. The amount of shame that he feels from this event is something that he can't go on living with. The whole thing is such a fiasco for a British that after the Igbo Women's War of 1929, they have a colonial hearing about this, and they end up doing away with the warrant chief system across their African colonies. But that dual-mandated system ran for a long time in Nigeria and some of the other African colonies of the British, and that's really the hallmark of what they were able to establish there. In addition to that, and this is well contained within the slides, so I won't talk too much about this, you also have another major colonial figure named Cecil Rhodes, who's operating in South Africa. If you remember back to our lecture and the ongoing sort of tensions between the colonial government of the British in Cape Town and the Boer republics, it's ultimately going to be under Cecil Rhodes that they end up coming into a lot of conflict, but it's also under Cecil Rhodes that the British are going to lay out this vision for their colonies in Africa. They want to connect Cairo and Egypt all the way down to Cape Town in South Africa, giving them one contiguous landmass in East Africa. And that's something they will be successful in doing, but it will take them until after World War I, when the Germans have to give their colonies over to the French and the British due to a loss suffered in that war. So, as I've already spoken about German and Portuguese colonialism, and really what is all that's really left to say is basically the impact that the world wars and the interwar period are going to have on colonialism in Africa. And really what they're going to do is, like I said, World War I is going to mean that Germany is abandoning all of their colonial holdings in Africa, and they're going to have to give them to the French and the British. The French and the British are going to be splitting them up after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles that ends that war. And so a lot of people, a lot of Africans who fought for the Germans are returning back to colonies that are no longer run by the Germans. And in both world wars, it suffices to say the reason that these wars are truly global is because Europeans have colonized most of the globe, and they're fighting their colonial subject, or they're forcing their colonial subjects to fight. And so at the end of the day, what you end up with is you have a system in which a bunch of people are fighting a war that they really don't care much about on a personal level, but they're being forced to do it under their colonial regimes. And so ultimately, the Germans are going to give up their territories. That means you're going to see Cameroon gets turned over to the French. You're going to see Tanganyika becomes Tanzania. You have Benin and Togo become French territories. And so ultimately, all the areas that the Germans once claimed are going to become French or British. That's the major impact. Now, in the interwar period, there's something unique going on in world history here, and it's called the Great Depression. This is a global, worldwide depression that starts in the United States, and because of sort of the global banking system that's set up after World War I, it's going to embroil the entire world in an economic downturn. And one thing that needs to be said about the interwar period when it comes to Africa is that the colonial powers are going to try to insulate their own citizens, meaning people who are living in France or England or any of the other colonial nations in Belgium or in Spain or Portugal. What they're going to be trying to do is they want to use their colony's export economy to buffer the impact of the global depression. And what that's going to do is have a very negative impact on the quality of life for Africans. In other words, we're going to let the colonies go absolutely broken, starve to death, before our people start suffering during the Great Depression. And so colonies are used as sort of a way for the European powers to lessen the impact of the sort of global depression on their own societies. So Africans are going to be suffering very badly under that particular scheme during the Great Depression. And that brings us finally to World War II. And World War II is really sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to colonialism. And what's happening there is, just like in the First World War, colonial subjects are being called up by their colonial powers to fight. They're going to North Africa, they're fighting in Europe, they're fighting in the Pacific. And at the end of the day, what's happening is they're going to be coming back. They're mostly fighting for the Allied powers by way of France and Britain. And so when they're coming back, when they start returning to the continent of Africa after the war, when these veterans come back, they basically say, hey, how is it that I can go over to Europe or to the Pacific and die for my colonial power, but when I come back home, I don't get to vote, I don't get any say in the political process that plays out here. So why is it that I have to go die for this colonial power, but they don't show me any of that respect when I come back home? And ultimately, it's going to be the growing dissatisfaction of this returning veteran class that fuels the decolonization and nationalism process that we are going to be looking at next week. Now, before I sign off here today, I just want to encourage you all to take a look at the slides I put up for our case study, and that is King Leopold's seizure of the Congo, or the establishment of what they call the Congo Free State. I want to say there are some very disturbing images associated with what you're seeing there in the Congo Free State in an attempt to extract rubber. But I think it's important that you all see firsthand what it is that's actually playing out in these colonies. And this is a particularly nasty case of colonialism because you don't even have governmental oversight. A lot of people don't get to look and voice their opinions on what's happening there. It is simply one man imposing his will over this entire territory. And I explain how that happens on the slides, and I show you some pretty gruesome pictures as to how this plays out. But basically, King Leopold of Belgium is going to turn the Congo Free State into his own personal rubber extracting colony. And the impact that has on the local Congolese population is going to result in mass amputations for a failure to collect enough rubber. And then ultimately the starvation and emaciation of the entire Congolese population because they're not allowed to grow food. They have to only work on rubber. So the case study within the Congo sort of shows you all of the things we've been talking about today coming together in one particularly extreme example. Well, that's my spiel for this week. I hope that this clarifies things rather than confuses people. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to send those my way by email or pop into my office hours. Take care.